Hello, today I'm going to be sharing with you some of the things that go through my mind when I am cueing and sequencing when I teach Pilates. This is mostly based on my experience as a biokineticist and some of the common problems that I see, and basically influences the types of exercises that I include in a lot of my Pilates classes. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do is maximize people's ability to connect with themselves, finding their neutral or corrected posture essentially, or finding their capacity to move in various different postures or their capabilities. So if we can find thoracic extension, how can we invite people to meet that thoracic extension in a lifestyle where perhaps they might spend a lot of time in a kyphotic posture? By utilizing lots of anatomical knowledge or terminology, I hope to also enhance your ability to understand the terminology and perhaps use it more frequently in your own practice as well, or at least in your own mind when you're thinking about cueing and teaching classes. Great. So today we're starting with a seated position, sometimes called a crook position, which is more of the anatomical, rehabilitative, postural starting point. So I like to cue feet hip width apart or sit bone width apart because of how this aligns the legs with the place that they come out of, being the hip sockets. So there is a space in between those feet. 1 fist distance is a little bit easier for people to understand because they don't necessarily know where their sit bones are. But inviting them to think about where those sit bones are can help them to start to understand where their sit bones are, where their body is in space. And that becomes a useful anatomical landmark for them to think about as we start to work on that hip hinge or the pelvic tuck and all of those wonderful, wonderful movements. So I'll cue feet hip width apart or hip-ish width apart. Doesn't roll off the tongue quite as nicely. But what we have here then is the toes are in somewhat, well, the feet are in somewhat plantar flexed as opposed to dorsiflexed, which is flexed towards the dorsal portion. So if you think about a fish that has a dorsal fin on its back, this is the dorsal portion of the foot. So we plantar flex, toes point, plantar flex the feet away. So for some people, they might not have the ankle range to do this. For others, because of that amount of pointing of those ankles, they can sometimes cramp up into the calf muscles as well. So being mindful that not everyone has flat feet available to them. I'm also seeing quite a few of my patients start to roll their feet onto the outside edges of the foot, so it's a nice place to get them to connect with that tripod foot position without having to be balancing on one leg, for example. So we press the ball of the foot, ball of the big toe down into the ground, maybe even connect with the idea of lifting through the arches. Perhaps by flattening out the feet, their knees might start to cave inwards, so it's an opportunity to then show them that their knees can open whilst the foot presses down, or maybe it can't initially, but that is something that they're going to work towards as well. So those toes are long and not scrunched, feet are flat, heels are flat as well. The knees are bent. If you want to cue with feet a little bit further away to offload the hips a little bit, you'll notice that the feet become more plantar flexed, which increases the likelihood for cramping, or maybe they can't have their feet all the way down on the ground. So depending on what your outcomes are for the day, you may decide that closer feet with flat foot is more important, but knowing that you're then going to maybe lose if they don't have the strength here, that this might become a bit of a limiting point or a sticking point in their ability to meet this position. So finding that comfortable distance and neutral alignment, you can also then cue from neutral, legs coming together or legs further apart, pregnant bellies, for example, or just differently shaped bodies, or maybe you're teaching a little bit more adduction of those inner thighs working towards one another. Because as we start to do a roll down C shape, they may not be able to hold that inner thigh activation and the knees start to splay open. So it's an opportunity there to cue active inner thighs. So from that neutral. Moving up the legs, we then want to have the pelvis in an upright position, which requires strength from the hip flexors. So the hip flexor muscles, which partly form a part of the quads, they attach onto the front of the hip bone. So these muscles have to shorten to pull the hip bone tight towards the thighs in hip flexion, because it's the hip flexors doing the work. And in doing so, you're then rocking forwards onto the sit bones. So instead of the sit bones tucking under towards the heels, you rock forwards on the sit bones, which requires that these hip flexors shorten to pull the pelvis into a more upright position, instead of that pelvis tipping and spilling everything out the back. So sit bones tilt forwards, anchoring into those sit bones, pubic bone tilting forwards as well, so we can bring that pelvis into an upright position. If there's a lot of hamstring tightness here, which is also pulling the sit bones to the backs of those knees, as you move into that hip flexion, the hamstrings may start to limit your ability to sit into this position as well. So, and it can start to burn literally just from this upright pelvis position. Then we have the opportunity to lengthen the spine in its neutral alignment. So if the pelvis is tucked under, that lower back may be a bit more rounded, and as a compensation, the upper back may be a bit rounded as well. So the more we can get that neutral pelvis, so even there you can get sort of neutral pelvis, but maybe the upper back can't lengthen, so we want to start to lengthen the upper back as well and find neutral and soft shoulders. Broadness across the chest and collarbones, length through the crown of the head, and a neutral head and neck position as well. Because you may find that as people start to sit more upright, maybe their chin juts a little bit forwards, increasing that lordosis in the cervical spine, but we want that neutral neck, head slightly retracted in opposition to that forward head position. So head retracts, spine lengthens, so we undo that kyphotic curve into a longer, more upright position. And again, without arching or hyperextending through the spine, and that can come depending on the person, either from the lumbar spine, the thoracic spine, usually the midpoint between the thoracic and the lumbar, so that T12L1, that will tend to kind of hoy out into an arched back. We want to maintain more of that neutral, shoulders slightly retracted, not pinching backwards, but slightly retracted and depressed, so we're not scrunching the shoulders around the ears, finding that neutral position. Hands maybe gently on the backs of the knees to compensate in a healthy way for the lack of strength in the hip flexors. So maybe the hands just let the hip flexors breathe just a little bit. It is a nice opportunity there as well to use those shoulder blades to retract, to puff the chest a little bit more forwards, and then there's a bit more softness allowed for the head to settle in a neutral position. And you can kind of find that position as well without all of these different pieces fighting for priority as you make those adjustments.